When I first saw Mr. Mott, my impressions were that he was a very tall, handsome man, white hair, very erect, interesting. And I thought, well, this is wonderful. You know, something new has happened. Did C.S. ask my father for my hand? Of course he did. Just like everybody else generally does.
For this small boy, born Charles Stewart Mott, the year 1875 was to mark the beginning of a journey which would last almost a century. Here in Newark, New Jersey, a mere 10 years after the Great War between the states, the Civil War, John Coon Mott and Isabella Turnbull Stewart could hardly have envisioned the life awaiting their son. To all boys, the world is within their grasp. They can be and do anything. Yet few are given his measure of extraordinary ability, strength of character, self-discipline. Fewer still have met his measure in contributing to their community and beyond, to improving the lives of others. The rippling effect of Charles Stewart Mott's good works will see no end, but touch lives of those yet unborn. 1892. 17-year-old Charles Stewart Mott enters the Stevens Institute of Technology, the course of study, mechanical engineering. It was the 1890s. A wave of immigrants provided workers for that awakening industrial giant, America. This was his world, filled with experiences, observations that would shape and mold his character. Gunner's Mate First Class Charles Stewart Mott served aboard the USS Yankee. It was the Spanish-American War of 1898. Letters home held vivid descriptions of action aboard the cruiser in Cuban waters. With the death of his father on Stewart's birthday in 1899, the 24-year-old assumed full responsibility for the family. It meant joining his uncle in managing their company, Weston Mott of Utica, New York, producer of wheels for all kinds of vehicles, among them a new invention, the automobile. He was an engineer, a businessman, but his roots were in the land.
I was born of poor but honest parents. My father was born on a farm. In fact, I came from a line of sodbusters.
A sodbuster, with a deep-seated, passionate love of the land. June 14th, 1900. Charles Stewart Mott and Ethel Culbert Harding were married. They would have 3 children, Aimee, Elsa, and Harding, seen here with his mother. It was the turn of the century. A sense of change, of excitement, of unlimited possibilities was everywhere. But none can know the future, can anticipate events which mark boundaries in life. Unknown to C.S. Mott, but destined to play a major role in his life, was Ruth Rawlings.
I was born in El Paso, Texas, October 18th, 1901. And my parents were Dr. Junius Ambrose Rawlings from Kentucky, and my mother was Sarah Esmond Mott Rawlings from New York State. I lived in El Paso all of my young life, went to school at an El Paso School for Girls, a very lovely private school. It was a long ways from my home, so I had a lovely little Mexican pony named Chapo, and Chapo and I went to school together. I finally graduated from that school in about 1919, and then went to LaSalle, at that time, Seminary in Auburndale, Massachusetts, just outside of Boston. Because of my interest in sports and everything in that line, I went to the Boston School of Physical Education in Brookline on the Fenway. That was a 2-year course. It was sometimes called Miss Bouvet School. And after that, I had to get a job. My father wanted me to earn my own money. So I said, well, yes, I have to go look for a job. So I had a choice of various schools to go to that needed a physical education teacher. And the first one was the Friends Private Day School in Baltimore. So I went there and was interviewed, and I got the job. So I stayed there 2 years, teaching physical education plus athletics. But I also became interested in dancing. I went to New York and took lessons. I went to Los Angeles and took lessons. Then I really had the nerve to open a studio of dancing at that age.
The future and fortune of Charles Stewart Mott would be tied to the progress of that new invention, the horseless carriage. His first automobile, a Remington, was bought in 1901. The cost? $364.25. Weston Mott of New York had prospered. The factory was running night and day, when suddenly all orders were canceled. The new and volatile auto industry had chosen to discontinue wire wheels in favor of wooden artillery wheels.
We went out and tried to sell them artillery wheels, and then they told us they wanted axles. So we had to design axles. Of course, I don't know to what extent I'd ever even seen an axle, but we knew what it had to be in a general way, and so we designed front and rear axles with Hyatt bearings, and I went out and I sold a year's output of our factory before we made the first axle. But believe me, I sweat blood in doing it.
C.S. Mott returned with $250,000 of sales. Weston Mott was on its way to becoming the world's largest wheel and axle manufacturer. Bill Durant, a Weston Mott customer, was making Buick motor cars in Flint, Michigan.
On Friday before Labor Day, 1905, Durant came to Utica to see our axle plant, and that night, with my wife and my partner, we went to Flint, and within 3 days we had contracted to move to Flint. I was old man then, 30 years old. July 1st, 1906, we started production in Flint, and on February 1st, 1907, I moved my family to Flint and have lived there ever since.
Here the Mott family grew, and here expansion followed expansion as the business grew.
Along in 1908, Durant had the big idea of forming a General Motors company. He wanted to bring the axle business into the corporation, so he took over 49% of the stock of the Weston Mott Company. I kept 51%, and General Motors was in business.
C.S. Mott served 3 terms as mayor of Flint. Elected in 1912 at age 37, his training as an engineer prepared him for his first major task. 40,000 citizens were sharing water and sewage facilities, barely adequate for 10,000. He solved that problem, the first of many. 1913 would be a significant year in affairs of business. General Motors bought the remaining 51% of Weston Mott stock. C.S. would serve on the board of directors for the next 60 years, with the distinction of being the largest single stockholder. With the purchase of 64 acres in the heart of Flint, construction was begun on a house, garage, and gatekeeper's cottage. It was the spring of 1916. There was a wonderful apple orchard to be seen from the home, and the estate was named Applewood.
All this beauty was planted, and it has grown and grown and developed to what you see today. Flowering fruit trees, beautiful lawns, early spring flowers, such as the tulips in bloom, the daffodils. Spring has sprung in Applewood today, and it's beautiful. And I know a little ditty about the crocus, and it goes like this. All at once the thunder woke us, and the rains came down to soak us, and before the eye could focus, crocus.
1918, American troops fought and died in the war to end all wars, World War I. Major C.S. Mott made his contribution, bringing his engineering and production skills to the Army Quartermaster Corps. In 1921, Mott was made chief of the advisory staff of General Motors. This meant Monday through Friday in Detroit, weekends at Applewood in Flint. It was a sacrifice for the close-knit family, climaxed by the tragic death of Ethel Harding Mott in 1924. It'd be 10 years before Applewood would once again respond to the loving care of a wife and mother. 10 years before an exchange of place cards at a dinner party in El Paso, Texas, before Ruth Rawlings would meet, come to know, and love this uncommon man. Whenever possible, C.S. traveled west to vacation as cowboy and ranch hand. He took great pleasure in being called Desert Dick. This love of the outdoors led to a meeting Desert Dick would never forget.
This was in 1932. I had a call from a mutual friend of ours in El Paso that she was having a dinner party for a Mr. Mott from Flint and his son Harding. And would I mind having a blind date with the son Harding? I said, no, not at all. And I didn't know who Mr. Mott was or anything about him. And so on the evening of the party, this tall, white-haired, good-looking gentleman came to the door, and my mother and father were there to greet him. And as he came in, he looked at Mott crest on our wall in the hall. And he said to my mother, well, is that your crest? She said, yes. Well, he said, that's my crest. So they sat down, they talked genealogy, and discovered that they were fifth cousins by the same lineage. And so when I came into the room and was introduced, well, he said, here's Ruth, another cousin, Cousin Ruth. And I have been called Cousin Ruth ever since. But my blind date was out in the car. And so we all went to pick up the date for Mr. Mott and went to the party. When we got to the party, Mr. Mott changed the place cards so that Harding had his date and he had me.
Changing place cards revealed more than a passing interest in Cousin Ruth. It was the opening move in a courtship and marriage that would last 41 years. He was 57, she 31. His interest was demonstrated by an unusual action, the forwarding of his daily diary.
For a year, 1932 to 1933, I received his diary. And that was flattering because I was not a real member of the family at all. I found that he commented that I was a tall, blonde, charming, intelligent, and I thought, well, that's pretty nice. There were a number of years difference between us, quite a number, but it didn't seem to make that much difference. Very entertaining, interesting, very opinionated. He was very impressed that I had earned my own living for a number of years, almost 8 years, I believe it was, because at that time, not many young women were going into business. Yes, there were teachers. Well, I was a teacher, but in the field of dancing, I had to maneuver that myself.
October 13th, 1934, the end of a courtship, the beginning of a marriage. From the chapel in El Paso to a Hawaiian honeymoon, to Flint and Applewood. With Ruth as mistress, the home would bear her stamp, echo to the sounds of their children, for they would have 3, Susan, Stuart, and Mary Ann. Applewood stands today much as it did then, a stately Tudor mansion. Among the masters whose paintings grace the walls of Applewood may be seen Hals, Van Dyck, Rembrandt, Corot, Holbein, Reynolds, Gainsborough, Homer, and Remington. Colonel Charles Stewart, a distinguished ancestor of C.S. Mott, served on General George Washington's staff. Among this collection are Revolutionary War memorabilia, gifts to Colonel Stewart from George Washington, Baron von Steuben, General Mad Anthony Wayne, and Robert Morse. The Charles Stewart Mott Foundation was formed in 1926 with an initial contribution of $320,000. Mott's devotion to opening doors of opportunity, to helping others learn to help themselves, was to become a full-time occupation. June 21, 1935, attending the local Rotary Club, Mott heard a speaker's plea for help for the children of Flint. Frank Manley, supervisor of physical education for the Flint Public Schools, found a kindred soul in C.S. Mott. Manley's message? Why build or rent buildings for boys' clubs and other programs when Flint schools sit empty, unused each afternoon? In his 90s, still active, still at work, Charles Stewart Mott comments on the birth of the community school concept.
So we started with only 6 schools and a very small budget. Actually, it was $6,000 and 5 schools, and it worked so well that next year went to 10 and so on until now, all the schools. And today, the schools over the United States are open, average 1,800 hours a year. Flint school buildings are open 3,800 hours a year. And I leave it to you to figure out how many $1 billion worth of school buildings are closed and what the economic loss is by closing the schools to the extent that they do.
For decades, visitors from around the world studied and emulated their model program, the community school concept. The Mott program, said C.S., is Frank Manley.
The thing that seemed to satisfy Mr. Mott the most was the ability through his Mott Foundation to improve the quality of life in Flint through education, through the community school programs, through the Children's Health Center, through his boys' camp. And so much of this had to do with the improvement of children's lives.
By 1988, the foundation would contribute gifts of more than $25 million each year out of a fund that exceeded $700 million. There's no way to measure the number of lives touched, the health, the quality of life improved as a result of his actions.
People maybe wonder what makes me tick. Well, it's the pleasure I get out of these things. It's not trying to be a big philanthropist or anything like that, but I'm having the time of my life, enjoyment in doing these things. It's the personal satisfaction I get out of it.
There's a consistency in the way people characterize this uncommon man, for he was one and the same to all. Nor would he measure your worth by class, position, or wealth. He was the most democratic of men, demanding only that you be forthright, make decisions based on solid evidence, and most important, that you exercise common sense.
He was always improving his mind and his knowledge. He loved movies. He loved Applewood. He loved animals, which is true of this place when he had so many animals. He loved horses. He rode very well. He loved the West and used to go to Arizona nearly every winter. And we went together several times and enjoyed all the rides that we had, Western style.
No wife could be more loving, understanding, qualities recognized and admired by her many friends, who in turn love her. They knew the unceasing effort required to organize whatever was needed so that C.S. could concentrate on issues demanding his attention. The law of compensation exacts its price with no respect for privilege. The price here, a mother's frequent absence from her children. Stories about Mott's personal use of money and things are legion. How do we reconcile giving $6 million for a children's hospital while insisting on using a pencil down to its nub? $1 million for education, a Chevy for transportation. C.S. Mott hated waste, appreciated value. He was, in fact, a living testament, a lesson to everyone. Never discard useful objects. He coveted neither attention or fame, but garnered both. Honors and tributes were bestowed in great number. Among them, the Big Brother of the Year Award, 1954. Though he would not engage in small talk, he had a great sense of humor.
Two old men went to a cemetery to help bury a confrere of theirs. After the body was lowered into the grave, one of them said to the other, "How old was our friend here, deceased friend?" He says, "Well, I think he was 85 years old." "Gee," says, "I'm 87, and how old are you?" He says, the other fellow says, "Gee, I'm 88. Hardly seems worthwhile walking home, does it?" Well, about time for me to walk home, I guess.
Time to walk home. A remark made in 1968, at the age of 93. But his health and spirit were good. It was not time to walk home, not yet. There was work to be done, and the Mott Foundation continued under his direction for 4 more productive years. The foundation continues his good work under the guidance of his son, C.S. Harding Mott. The Ruth Mott Fund was created in 1979, making its contribution to human health, the environment, performing arts, and prevention of nuclear war. And there are plans for Applewood.
A few years after Mr. Mott passed away, I thought, what am I going to do with this large home? I decided to have it opened as a memorial to my husband. He loved Applewood. He created Applewood. You cannot find homes anymore that can be built like this. You don't have the craftsmanship. You don't have the materials. It's preserving a real, beautiful place for others to enjoy. And it will be open, I hope, in a few years to the public, and then they can enjoy it as I have and others have all these years.
Charles Stewart Mott spanned America's second century. Born 1875, died 1973, the age of 97. Charles F. Kettering, inventor, scientist, close friend, and colleague, wrote, "Nothing ever built arose to touch the skies unless some man dreamed that it should. Some man believed that it could, and some man willed that it must." C.S. Mott was such a man. He dreamed, believed, and willed, lived not as master, but servant, for in the end, to help is to serve. Charles Stewart Mott never wavered from that goal. He stayed the course, enriched us all.